When I got the Man Who Would Be King, I was in the George V Hotel in Paris.
It's been almost 60 years since Alfie turned Michael Caine into a household name. Yet, even now, that role still shadows him. When Caine criticized Jude Law's 2004 remake, many chalked it up to ego, a veteran actor protecting his turf. But his recent reflections reveal something deeper. At 92, Caine is finally opening up about what Alfie really meant to him.
When they saw the rushes in America, one of the executives wrote back to Sid Fury, the director, and said,
Not just the story of a smooth-talking ladies' man, but a reflection of a generation torn between innocence and self-interest. And for the first time, he's acknowledging what went wrong, not just with the remake, but with the message he helped bring to life. The forgotten torture of young Caine. Let's take it back to March 14th, 1933, when the world first met Maurice Joseph Micklewhite Jr., the boy who would one day be known as Michael Caine. He was born in London, at St. Olave's Hospital in Rotherhithe, into a working-class family that lived life one hard-earned paycheck at a time. His mother spent her days cooking and cleaning, while his father hauled crates at the Billingsgate Fish Market. Every evening, his dad came home smelling of fish, a smell that clung to him and filled their small home. But that job also meant there was always food on the table, even if sometimes the fish came from borrowed stock at the market. Caine would later laugh about it, saying that by the time he was 15, he never wanted to see another fish again. Those humble beginnings, though, were about to be overshadowed by something far darker. Caine was still just a boy when World War II erupted, and although he was far too young to fight, the war would shape his childhood in ways he could never forget. Like countless London children, he was evacuated, pulled away from his family, and sent to Norfolk, more than 100 miles from home. The move was supposed to keep him safe, but what awaited him there was anything but. The family who took him in resented the idea of having a Cockney boy under their roof. The resentment turned cruel, with regular beatings becoming part of his daily life. And that wasn't the worst of it. Every Friday evening, before heading off for the weekend, the family would lock young Caine and another evacuee inside a cupboard. They were left there until Monday morning, surviving only on a few pork pies and water. For a child already terrified by the war, this was another kind of battlefield altogether. But the cruelty didn't stay hidden. Caine's mother, Ellen Frances Marie, eventually discovered what was happening. Fierce and uncompromising, she traveled to Norfolk to confront the family herself. The confrontation was explosive, so much so that Ellen nearly landed herself in prison after beating the woman of the house. Still, her fury had its purpose. Her son was freed from that nightmare and never returned. Back in London, however, there was little relief. The Blitz destroyed the family's home, and when the war finally ended, the government placed them in a small, prefabricated house in Elephant and Castle. It was meant to be temporary housing, but they would live there for 18 years. For young Maurice, it was still an improvement. His earlier flats hadn't even had a toilet. Life in those cramped quarters wasn't easy, but it was enough. And by then, he already had bigger dreams forming. Even before the war came to its close, he had discovered something that would change everything: a love for acting. It didn't begin in glamorous fashion, but it was the spark that would carry him far beyond those working-class streets of London. How war nearly ended his story. Michael Caine's journey into acting started much earlier than most people realize. At just 10 years old, he stepped onto the stage for the first time, playing the father of the ugly stepsisters in a school production of Cinderella. The performance didn't go quite as planned. When he walked out, the audience erupted in laughter. Young Maurice Micklewhite, as he was then called, had no idea why they found it so funny. The reason was simple, but unforgettable. His fly was undone. Instead of being humiliated, he embraced the moment, thrilled that he was getting laughs, even if it was at his own expense. That easygoing attitude toward embarrassment would stay with him for life. But that slip-up wasn't what made him fall in love with acting. After the play, He actually drifted away from the stage for a while. A few years later, at 14, fate nudged him back. He happened to pass by his school's drama class, and something immediately caught his attention. Not the scripts or the stage, but the girls. The classroom was full of them. As a shy teenager with little confidence, he quickly put two and two together. Actors on stage got to kiss the pretty girls. That thought sealed it. In that moment, Maurice Micklewhite saw a path to a future he hadn't imagined before. Still, acting would have to wait. Like so many young men of his generation, he first had to serve his country. He joined the Royal Fusiliers as part of his national service, and soon enough, he was sent to Korea, where he faced the grim realities of war. The combat changed him profoundly. Coming from a working-class background, he had once leaned toward communist sympathies. But what he witnessed in Korea, the treatment of civilians by North Korea and China, shook those beliefs to the core. By the time he returned home, any hint of those ideas was gone. The war had already scarred him, but the ordeal that followed nearly killed him. After his platoon returned to England, the soldiers began to fall ill. They had contracted cerebral malaria, a vicious disease that swept through their ranks. Instead of receiving proper care, Caine and his comrades were used in a disturbing experiment. Placed under the watch of an American officer named Colonel Solomons, the men were strapped to their beds, injected with drugs to keep them subdued, and left in restraints for 11 long days. Caine later said he barely survived. Yet out of that terrifying experience came a revelation. Being so close to death taught him to value every moment of life. From then on, he promised himself to live fully, from the moment he woke up until the moment he went to sleep. Back in England, with his life restarted, Caine returned to acting with a new fire. But the road was not easy. The early years were a grind of endless auditions, rejections, and stretches of unemployment that left him wondering if he would ever make it. Like many struggling actors, he leaned heavily on alcohol, often drinking a bottle of vodka a day, sometimes even more. He would later joke that being a British actor for 20 years was all the research anyone needed to play a drunk convincingly. Still, he persevered. Determined to make a living in the profession he loved, he realized his own name wasn't helping. Maurice Micklewhite didn't sound like a name destined for billboards, so he adopted a simpler one, Michael White. Under this new identity, he landed a role in Wuthering Heights, fittingly playing a drunkard. The part opened new doors, earning him a spot with the Lowestoft Repertory Company in Suffolk. There, still in his early 20s, Michael began to find his footing as both an actor and a man. And it was in that setting that another turning point appeared. Patricia Haynes, a young actress who quickly captured his heart. The two fell hard and fast, marrying soon after. But as much as they tried to build a life together, it wasn't built to last, and the marriage eventually fell apart. Maurice's struggle before becoming Caine. Now, before the age of 22, Michael Caine was already stacking up roles, a promising sign of things to come. But as he would later admit, the first 9 years of his career felt far less like a dream and more like a punishment. Brutal, exhausting, and closer to purgatory than paradise. And then came another obstacle, his name. The man born Maurice Micklewhite had already shifted names once, but when he discovered there was another Michael White on the London stage, he was forced to find yet another identity. The turning point happened in the most ordinary of places, a phone booth in Leicester Square. His agent called with urgent instructions, "Pick a new name immediately." Standing there, distraught, he looked up across the street and spotted the Odeon Cinema. Playing at the time was The Caine Mutiny, starring Humphrey Bogart. Just like that, Michael Caine was born. It was a decision that shaped the rest of his life, though he often laughed about how accidental it really was. In interviews, he liked to joke that if he had looked the other way that day, he might have ended up calling himself Michael 101 Dalmatians. While the name Michael Caine became legendary around the world, he never lost sight of his roots. Beneath the fame, he still saw himself as Maurice Micklewhite, the son of a hard-working father he deeply admired. Maurice Sr. had been a constant presence in his life, but tragedy struck in 1957 when he died in his son's arms. He never lived to see Caine's success, and that absence weighed heavily on the actor for the rest of his life. Decades later, when Michael Caine was knighted, he found a way to honor that bond. Professionally, he had to use his stage name, but he asked to be knighted as Maurice Micklewhite to pay tribute to his father. It was his way of keeping the man who shaped him at the center of his triumph. Looking back, Caine often reflected on one of his deepest regrets, that his father never got to see the success he fought so hard to achieve. With his trademark mix of wit and melancholy, he once said that when his father was alive, he was just a penniless bum, and now he was simply a rich one. It was a bittersweet truth. Only after his father's death did years of struggle finally give way to the breakthrough that changed everything. By the late 1950s, Michael Caine had been grinding long enough on the London stage to start making some real connections in the theater world. Things were finally beginning to move, and he even ended up sharing a place with another young actor, a fellow Cockney by the name of Terence Stamp. The two were inseparable, spending their days hustling from audition to audition, and their nights drowning out rejection with drinks. Not long after, they crossed paths with someone who was already a little further along in his career, Peter O'Toole. For Caine, that meeting was the start of a friendship that would lead him into unforgettable and often chaotic experiences. In 1959, Caine landed a gig as O'Toole's understudy in the play The Long and the Short and the Tall. It was a massive opportunity, and the bond between the two actors grew quickly. But Caine had no idea what he was getting into when it came to O'Toole's legendary drinking habits. Where Caine could hold his own, O'Toole turned drinking into an art form. One night after a performance, O'Toole invited Caine to dinner. Caine expected something ordinary, but instead found himself staring at a plate of fries and a bottle of brandy, the full spread, O'Toole style. They ate, they drank, and then blackout. The next thing Caine knew, he was waking up fully clothed in a strange apartment, with O'Toole lying in the same bed. When he checked the clock, panic hit. It was 5 p.m. He thought it was Sunday, meaning he was safe from missing work. He realized it was already Monday. 2 whole days had vanished. With a performance looming just hours away, the pair scrambled to get themselves together and barely made curtain call. For Caine, it was a crash course in surviving O'Toole's world. His friend offered one piece of advice from years of experience. Never ask what happened during a bender. It was always better not to know. This wasn't exactly unusual for Caine in those years. Out-of-work actors had their own unofficial hangout in London's West End, a cafe near a casting office. The routine was predictable. Pick up a small part at the office, get paid for the day, then head to the cafe to spend it all on food and drinks. They'd party until morning, wake up, and repeat. It was reckless, but for Caine, it was all part of climbing toward something greater. The difference between him and many of his peers was his sense of discipline. He had seen too much in life already. World War II service, military hardship, even being strapped to a hospital bed for nearly 2 weeks. He had no interest in throwing everything away. No matter how much he drank, he never did it on the job, and he always stayed professional when it mattered. Drugs never had much of a hold on him either. He only tried marijuana once, and the result was enough to put him off forever. He laughed uncontrollably for 5 hours straight, so much so that no taxi driver would even stop for him. Forced to walk home, he decided that was his first and last time. Meanwhile, his personal life was shifting. His first marriage, already strained, fell apart in the early 1960s. By then, though, Caine was more focused on his career and on enjoying the attention that came his way. The swinging 60s suited him well, and he gained a reputation as a playboy, with high-profile romances ranging from Natalie Wood to Bianca Jagger, plus countless models in between. Yet for all the wild stories, his path wasn't just about nightlife and scandal. The real challenge was his voice. Today, his Cockney accent is one of the most recognizable in film, but at the start, it was a barrier. The British class system made it nearly impossible for someone who sounded working class to land serious roles. For many in London's acting circles, the idea of Caine playing anyone important was unthinkable. It would take an outsider, someone not tied down by Britain's rigid class expectations, to finally see past the accent and give him the break he had been fighting for. The film that opened Hollywood's doors. By 1964, Michael Caine's career finally began to break through with his role in the war epic Zulu. What's wild is that he was almost never cast at all. In the film, he played Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, the polished officer representing Britain's upper class. That was about as far as possible from the real Caine, a working-class kid with a heavy Cockney accent. In fact, the part he was first considered for made a lot more sense. Private Henry Hook, a Cockney rogue who faked illness to avoid fighting. But that role went to another actor, Jimmy Booth. Fate intervened when Caine met the director, Cy Endfield, in a bar. Endfield took one look at his tall frame, blonde hair, and sharp features, and said he looked like an officer. Caine would later joke that his entire movie career came down to the length of the bar at the Prince of Wales Theatre. He was already halfway out the door when Endfield called him back. Even then, there was a catch. The role of Bromhead required the voice of the elite, not a Cockney drawl. Endfield asked if he could do a posh accent. After nearly a decade of repertory theater, Caine told him he could handle any accent. A quick screen test proved him right, and suddenly, the role was his. Looking back, Caine believed it only happened because Endfield was American. A British director, tied up in class prejudices, would never have imagined a working-class actor playing a gentleman officer. That single casting choice broke barriers. Later in his career, Caine would proudly lean into his Cockney voice on screen, hoping to inspire other working-class actors to believe they belonged too. Filming in South Africa, however, left him with more than just a career breakthrough. The country was under apartheid, and Caine was horrified by the brutality he witnessed. He saw a white foreman strike a black worker in the face over something trivial. Producer Stanley Baker fired the man on the spot, but the larger system was immovable. For Caine, it was enough. He vowed never to work in South Africa again while apartheid stood, a promise he kept. When Zulu wrapped, things looked promising. The film's distributor signed him to a 7-year contract. Finally, security after years of scraping by. But the celebration was short-lived. Studio boss Joseph E. Levine tore up the deal almost immediately. His reason was as insulting as it was absurd. He told Caine that on screen he looked like a queer. Heartbroken, Caine pressed on, and history would prove Levine disastrously wrong. Caine's lack of formal acting training became part of his legend. He admitted his craft was built not in classrooms, but on buses and trains, where he studied how people carried themselves. That observational style shaped his performance in Zulu. To capture the upper-class air of Lieutenant Bromhead, he modeled his body language on Prince Philip. Ironically, this nearly cost him the role. When Paramount executives saw the first reels of film, they sent a telegram demanding he be fired, complaining that he didn't know what to do with his hands. What they didn't realize was that Caine was copying a prince. Endfield ignored the order, and Caine kept the part. Now, even without a proper contract, Michael Caine's performance in Zulu was the moment people finally started to take notice. It wasn't a leading role, but it put his name on the map. The industry was watching now, and while the big break hadn't arrived yet, Caine was clearly on the verge of something bigger. As the story goes, that turning point arrived one evening at the Pickwick Club in Soho. Caine was having dinner with his friend Terence Stamp, who was already riding high from an Oscar nomination for Billy Budd. Out of nowhere, a waiter slipped Caine a note, as if it were part of some spy game. The message came from Canadian producer Harry Saltzman, who was sitting nearby with his family, asking Caine to join him for a coffee. Caine jumped at the chance. Saltzman, after all, was one of the key producers behind the James Bond films. Naturally, Caine wondered if he was about to land a role alongside his friend Sean Connery. But Saltzman had something else in mind. He had just watched Caine in Zulu and loved what he saw. He asked if Caine had read Len Deighton's spy novel, The Ipcress File. By pure coincidence, Caine was already halfway through it. Some versions even claim he had the book with him at the table. Saltzman didn't waste time. He offered Caine the lead role in the film adaptation on the spot. And then came something even bigger. A 7-year contract with his company, Lowndes Productions, plus a follow-up meeting the very next day. Caine could hardly believe his luck. He rushed back to his table to tell Stamp, who was stunned at how quickly everything had changed. Caine always looked back at that night as the true beginning of his career. In interviews, he often pointed out that Zulu got him noticed, but it was the Ipcress File that made him a star. His portrayal of Harry Palmer, the working-class spy with glasses and a sharp mind, resonated with audiences. The film became a hit, spawning 2 sequels. It was deliberately positioned as the anti-Bond, smaller scale, grounded, and surprisingly progressive, with a lead character who treated women with respect instead of as conquests. Still, Caine's stint as Harry Palmer didn't stretch nearly as long as Connery's run as Bond. He was just 32 when Saltzman handed him that first big break, but by 35, he had already completed 3 Palmer films. That 7-year deal, which once seemed like a blessing, now looked like a trap. But Saltzman showed an unexpected generosity. Caine later explained in his memoir that instead of locking him into the original low-paying contract, Saltzman tore it up and rewrote a new one each year on Caine's birthday, always paying him at the going rate. That arrangement continued until his 35th birthday, when Caine opened Saltzman's envelope expecting another raise. Instead, he found the contract ripped into pieces, along with a note that read, "You're on your own now. Happy birthday." It was the end of their working relationship, though Caine always spoke of Saltzman with gratitude. After Zulu, many of Caine's roles cast him as upper-class types, delivered in the polished, received pronunciation that dominated British cinema. His real Cockney accent stayed hidden, even though it was the one that gave him so much character. But by the mid-1960s, the cultural mood was shifting. The Beatles had made working-class voices fashionable, and audiences wanted something more authentic. That moment came with Alfie in 1966. Here, Caine finally used his own Cockney accent in full force, and it changed everything. The film became a phenomenon, especially in America, and earned him his first Academy Award nomination. Just a few years later, he delivered one of the most quoted lines in British cinema in The Italian Job, cementing his status as a true star. But, as with many actors on the rise, not every decision that followed would shine quite as bright. Some missteps were just around the corner. Michael Caine and the murder that haunted him. It was a bleak January morning in 1967 when the headlines broke across the north of England like a cold punch. The so-called one-armed bandit murder was splashed across front pages, and the shock was immediate. At a time when people were already uneasy about the growing grip of organized crime in Britain, the discovery of Angus Sibbitt's body sent a chill through the country. Sibbitt was found dead in the back seat of his Jaguar Mark X, the car riddled with bullets, parked by the railway tracks near South Hetton. To most, this was no random act of violence. It had all the unmistakable signs of a professional gangland hit. The crime resonated so deeply that it slipped into pop culture. Years later, Mark Knopfler would write about it in his 2004 track 5:15 a.m., echoing the cold silence and violence of that morning. The title itself was a nod to the time Sibbitt's body was discovered by a miner heading to work in the early hours of January 5th. The killing not only inspired a best-selling novel, but also a film adaptation, ensuring the tragedy would linger in the public imagination for decades. Just 2 months after Sibbitt's death, 2 men, Vince Lavalio and Dennis Stafford, friends of the victim, were arrested, tried, and convicted of the murder. Both men furiously protested their innocence. Despite their pleas, they spent 12 years behind bars before finally being released in 1979. What followed was a lifelong battle to clear their names and uncover the truth about what really happened that night. Their fight for justice took a strange twist when Dennis Stafford began blaming Michael Caine, in part, for his struggles. The connection wasn't about personal dealings, but cinema. In 1971, 4 years after Stafford and Luvaglio's conviction, Michael Caine starred in the gritty gangster film Get Carter. Shot in and around Newcastle and County Durham, the very landscape of the real murder, the film struck nerves. It was raw, violent, and unflinchingly real, sparking controversy about whether movies glorified or even encouraged working-class violence. Audiences were shaken. Get Carter was adapted from Jack's Return Home, a novel inspired directly by the one-armed bandit murder. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Stafford himself later complained to the press that Caine, charging round on screen, blasting away with a shotgun, hardly helped his case. Caine, however, had his own intentions. He wanted to strip away the comic book exaggeration of mobsters on screen and instead portray a colder, more believable gangster. Still, the question lingered. Could a film really shape the way the public viewed Stafford and Luvalio? The answer was complicated. While cinema no doubt influenced public opinion, Stafford's reputation had been tarnished long before. He was no stranger to the law, carrying a rap sheet filled with firearms charges, escapes from custody, and fraud. Even after his release in 1979, he returned to prison twice more, once in 1989 for breaching parole, and again in 1994 for a failed traveler's check scam. In his later years, Stafford was frank about his past. He admitted openly that he had been a crook, but insisted he had never been a killer. To him, the real murderer was a hitman, and he had been framed. Whether or not that claim holds truth is a mystery that may never be resolved. What is clear is how closely art and life became intertwined in this story. The murder of Angus Sibbitt cast a long shadow, shaping not only criminal history, but also British cinema. Michael Caine's role in Get Carter became a symbol of that blurred line between real crime and its reflection on screen. And in the end, Stafford's protests served as a reminder that before pointing the finger outward, a man had to reckon with the weight of his own past. Michael Caine's hidden Hollywood redemption. In the early 1990s, Michael Caine hit one of the roughest patches of his career. It was flop after flop after flop. A shock to the system might have been an underrated drama, but then came the fantasy comedy Mr. Destiny, the messy con-man story Bullseye, the chaotic farce Noises Off, the forgettable crime thriller Blue Ice, and even Steven Seagal's disastrous directorial debut On Deadly Ground. None of them worked. To make matters worse, Caine tried to breathe new life into his old Harry Palmer role, a character that had once helped define him as a star. But the revival didn't land. The first film from decades earlier had been brilliant, but these sequels lacked the magic. By the time the fourth and fifth Palmer movies rolled around, made-for-TV productions filmed under miserable, unsanitary conditions with the shadow of organized crime in the background, the whole thing had turned into a disaster. For Caine, those shoots were the lowest point, arriving just as his career as a leading man was falling apart. Scripts were drying up, and the parts he was being offered forced him to face the reality of his age. At that point, Michael Caine was ready to call it quits. He had built a comfortable life as a restaurateur and figured he could retire in Miami, write his autobiography, and enjoy a slower pace. For a while, that seemed like the plan, until Jack Nicholson entered the picture. Nicholson, unlike Caine, was still very much on top of the Hollywood game. Through the 1990s, he was picking up high-profile starring roles and delivering powerhouse supporting performances. He had racked up more Oscar nominations than any other male actor and maintained an iconic public image, from his trademark grin to his regular appearances courtside at Lakers games. Films like Hoffa, As Good as It Gets, and A Few Good Men showed he was still operating at full force. When Nicholson visited Caine in Miami, he came with a clear message. Retirement didn't have to be the answer. As Caine later recalled, Nicholson persuaded him to reinvent himself, not as a movie star, but as a movie actor. The difference was crucial. Stars got parts written for them, but character actors had to adapt, to disappear into whatever role was on the page. It meant fewer leading roles and no longer getting the girl, but it also meant richer, more challenging work. Nicholson had a project in hand that made the idea real. He was starring in a noir thriller called Blood and Wine, and thought Caine was perfect for one of the supporting roles. Nicholson pushed, and eventually, Caine agreed. The film itself wasn't a hit. Critics were divided, and it made just over $1 million at the box office despite a $26 million budget. But for Caine, the experience was a turning point. Working alongside Nicholson reminded him of why he had become an actor in the first place. As he later admitted, however much he pretended to enjoy retirement, he was happiest when he was acting. Blood and Wine may not have been a commercial success, but it saved Caine's career. He credited that project with giving him another 20 years of work. It reignited his love for the craft and positioned him to embrace the kinds of roles that would define his later career. Instead of fading into quiet retirement, he found himself back in demand, eventually connecting with Christopher Nolan and stepping into some of the most celebrated performances of his career. While Jack Nicholson eventually retired from acting after 2010, Caine kept going. That choice he made in the mid-1990s to reinvent himself instead of walking away kept him on screen for another generation and cemented his legacy as one of cinema's enduring legends. At 92, Michael Caine finally reveals the truth about Alfie. It's tempting to imagine the atmosphere the next time Michael Caine and Jude Law crossed paths after Caine's blunt interview with The Independent in 2009. Despite the fact that the two actors were on friendly terms and had even starred together just 2 years earlier in the remake of Sleuth, Caine didn't hesitate to criticize Law's work in the 2004 remake of Alfie. To understand his remarks, it helps to look back at the two very different Alfies. In 1966, Caine's portrayal of the carefree London playboy became one of the defining roles of his career, capturing a mix of charm, swagger, and a touch of innocence that made the character compelling. But in his eyes, the remake missed that crucial ingredient. Caine argued that Law's version carried none of the naivety that made the original so effective. Where Caine's Alfie asked, with a kind of bewildered sincerity, what life was all about, Law's Alfie, according to Caine, seemed far too knowing from the moment he appeared on screen. That awareness, Caine suggested, tipped the character into something darker, less playful, more cynical. In Caine's telling, his Alfie was an innocent male chauvinist, a man who didn't fully grasp the impact of his actions. Law's Alfie, by contrast, came across as deliberate and calculating, a character who used women and discarded them without care. For Caine, that shift in tone transformed the story from slyly humorous to something more sinister.